Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open, a podcast featuring conversations with artists, writers, and curators. My name is Mike Sakazagawa, and this is episode 94. Today's guest is Rachel Zucker. Hello, everybody. Hello, welcome to the show. Today's guest is Rachel Zucker. Rachel Zucker is the author of 10 books, including Sound Machine, forthcoming from Wave Books in 2019. Her other books include a memoir, Mothers, and a double collection of prose and poetry, The Pedestrians. Her book, Museum of Accidents, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award, a recipient of fellowships from the National Endowment for the Arts, MacDowell Colony, and the Sustainable Arts Foundation. Zucker teaches poetry at New York University. Zucker is the founder and host of the podcast Commonplace, conversations with poets and other people. She's currently working on an immersive audio project, also called Sound Machine. So, you may have heard me mention Rachel's podcast Commonplace before. It's one of my favorite shows and one that has certainly influenced this show. I've been listening to Commonplace for a couple of years now, and I'm consistently impressed with the intimacy and depth of the conversations Rachel has with her guests. I've been wanting to read some of Rachel's work for a while now, and earlier this year at the AWP conference, I finally picked up a copy of her book, The Pedestrians, and, well, the book did something a lot like what my favorite kinds of photograph do, embodying something specific and personal, but also something everyday and commonplace and therefore familiar. And I'm really pleased to have gotten the chance to talk to Rachel about it. There's a link in the show notes to where you can pick up a copy of The Pedestrians, which I, of course, recommend. You will also find a pre-order link for Rachel's new book, Sound Machine, which will be released on September 3rd, as well as to the Sound Machine audio project. You can go to soundmachineproject.com to sign up for the project newsletter and get updates on the project's launch, which should be pretty soon. You'll also find a link to Commonplace, and all of those have my highest recommendation. Now, one more thing before we get started. For subscribers to the KTCO Patreon campaign, Rachel has very generously added a bonus reading of her poem, Pedestrian, the title poem of the book we're talking about in today's show. If you'd like to listen, just visit patreon.com/sakeriver. There's a link in the show notes for that, and make a pledge in any amount, and you'll get access to the full bonus archive, which includes readings from writers like Yin Yi, Michelle Britton Rosado, David Bowles, Lydia Kiesling, and many more. Once again, that's patreon.com/sakeriver, and that's sake like the drink and river like river. All right, let's get started. Here's my conversation with Rachel Zucker. So I was wondering if we could start with a reading.
Yes. Can I read 2 short pieces?
Sure.
Is that all right? Okay.
Yeah.
So these are both from Pedestrians, and The Pedestrians was supposed to be 2 separate books. One was Fables and one was Pedestrians. And I'm going to just read a short one from each. So from the sort of Pedestrians side of things, this poem is called Today My Son Told Me. Once, long ago, everything grew everywhere, all over the planet. People ate things and dropped what later became known as seeds. They started to notice things grew in certain places where they dropped what later became known as seeds. That's called cultivation, my son explained, and used the word crops. He said, crops changed everything. Hominids could stay in one place and fence animals. This was the birth of culture. People didn't need to gather and hunt all day, so they developed language and the ability to kill everything. Can I tell you why I chose that one?
Sure.
So I'm in Maine right now, and I'm here with my husband and my oldest and my youngest son. My middle son is in New York. And my oldest son, Moses, who I had this conversation with, I guess he must have been maybe 11 or 12 years old. He's 20 now, and he is between his first and second year of college, and he's reading a book called Against the Grain, which is about, I think, the history of cultivation and the kind of transitioned from hunter-gatherer societies to farming, or what he's been referring to as passive farming. And so the last week or so, when we've been sitting on the beach together or walking around, he's been talking to me about this book. And it's just so funny to me to be back in this same conversation with him, more than 8 years later. And it's a much more nuanced conversation now that we're having. And yet the feeling is very, very similar. And it's a feeling, of just sort of being in the presence of one of my sons discovering something that he didn't know, and then realizing I didn't know it either, and learning from them, and feeling that he used a phrase from this book that I know is going to show up in my writing somewhere, which is crowding disease. So anyway, that's why I chose that, because it's just so present for me. Can I read this one other one?
Sure.
Okay, so this is from Fables, and these were all written in prose, and they were meant to be seen as prose. And this one, there's a section in here called Ocean, and all of those were also written in Maine, in the same place that I am right now. She sat on the deck, face in the shade, legs in the sun, reading books by people in the faraway city. She'd cry a little or watch a small mammal run across the road. Once she was on the phone with a poet who lived on the other coast, and she described the creature she thought was a beaver, woodchuck, or hedgehog. The poet on the other coast assured her with great confidence that it was a woodchuck. He explained that woodchucks' legs are designed for hills, and that's why, when running on flat ground, the animal looked as if he were hopping on his back legs. Totally, she told the poet, even though she didn't know the names of the animals or birds or trees or flowers, and had trouble sitting still and spent most of her time wondering why she was reading sad memoirs. Every day she watched the UPS truck come toward her up the road, make a 3-point turn into the driveway before hers, and pull away. It rains. Okay. I said it right. That's all right. No, you're right. You're right. That's a totally different one. You're right. Anyway, so that, I haven't looked at this book for a long time, by the way. And part of the pleasure for me in thinking about this book is also thinking about, I know that what I was waiting for, from the UPS truck was the copy of Museum of Accidents. The first copy. It was exactly this time of year, and I was very eagerly awaiting that from Wave. And I am now eagerly awaiting the first copy of Sound Machine. So there's just like a lot of weird 10-year resonances for me.
It's funny, I guess. Well, first of all, before I say anything else, I just wanted to say that, one, I really enjoyed this book quite a bit. And two, I think that you probably know this because we've talked about it, but I really enjoy your show quite a bit.
Thank you.
Yeah. I was thinking about it a little bit and thinking, like, I wonder if it's it might be a little weird to talk about a book that's 5 years old now. So, like, it might not feel quite as immediate as when you were doing interviews and stuff for it when it first came out.
Well, actually, I didn't really do hardly any interviews when it first came out. The Pedestrians and my sort of hybrid memoir, Mothers, both came out in 2014, not that long after my mother died. And I really was not capable of doing that much when the book came out. So it's kind of nice, actually, to talk about this book.
Sometimes I think maybe it's nice to get a little space between a piece of work and the sort of talking about it. Like, even though obviously, like with a book, even by the time it's come out, you've had a little distance from the making of it. But maybe even after that, having a little more time to sort of digest and marinate could be a little useful. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's funny you pick these two poems. I feel like, I always ask people to pick what they're going to read. And almost invariably they end up picking things that have been ones that stood out to me. Although I have this suspicion that if they picked something else, that would also feel like it was one that stood out. But I feel like there's things that run through these two poems, or pieces or whatever they are, that run through the whole book. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's one of the things that was particularly interesting to me about considering this book was, so this prose piece, this opens the ocean section of Fables, but the two sections, like you said, I think just now, and I've read elsewhere that they were intended to be two separate books originally, like maybe more like chapbooks, but they kind of overlap a lot. And like in particular with this one thing where you're describing this phone call with another poet, and talking about this creature, there's a poem in the second part, I think it's on page 129 in my notes, where you...
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, where you're describing, it seems like you're describing the same kind of thing, or at least like a similar moment where you're like this sort of woodchuck or muskrat or groundhog scurries in and out of the hilly underbrush. And, and there are moments where like also the UPS truck comes in this one, like a mail truck comes later. It feels like there's these resonances between where it's almost like you're describing the same thing, but in different modes. If that makes sense. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, that I think is a really accurate description of what's happening in the Pedestrians. And I would just add to this that I wrote Fables mostly in the summer in Maine, one in Paris, and then in New York, and then the poems in the Pedestrians overlapped in terms of the time of when I was writing them. So maybe there was like a 1 to 2 year period of time in which I was writing what then much later became the Pedestrians, Fables, and Mothers. So in a way, the three books are a triptych, or I guess the two books are a triptych, but the three pieces are a triptych. And there are like dreams that I write about in the Pedestrians that I also write about in Mothers. So there are definitely common concerns. I would say there are probably common concerns in all my books. But in these two books, the Pedestrians and Mothers, there's also just the same situations that I'm writing about, and certainly the same people, the same kinds of thoughts and experiences. And I think that you're exactly right that I'm interested in trying to see what happens to a story when it's kind of approached or transmitted in different modes of consciousness or different levels of awareness or awakeness and different forms. So, what happens when it's in prose? What happens when it's in verse? What happens if it's in memoir? What happens if it's sort of in third person, not fictionalized, but with the feeling of fiction? And those, I think that those kind of like modes of awareness is as much the subject of the book as anything else. So yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that, I spend a lot of time feeling like I'm making all kinds of mistakes and feeling embarrassed about all of my choices. And one of the things I tend to doubt is the way in which maybe my books are all about the same thing. We're in a good situation right now since you've only read one of them. So you, you haven't yet had the feeling of like, again, you're writing about that again. But I guess with the Pedestrians, I was sort of thinking about like, well, yeah, I am writing about the same things in one sense again, although, a lot of artists do that, their whole lives, but maybe I'm writing about it with a slightly different focus or a different lens or a different awareness. Like there are different things that are brought to the forefront. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think most artists, you can sense some kind of a through line in their different works and bodies of work, I think that, I mean, it's always the same person. So there is going to be something in common. Don't you think?
I think so. I mean, sometimes I think like a poet like Alice Notley, the way the books look and the way they sound in some ways is so different from book to book. And I admire that very much. At the same time, like it's all Alice Notley. Mm-hmm. It's her same concerns. And I love that about Alice Notley. So, a poet, I think like Sharon Olds, even though her books are different from book to book, I think the consistency is more similar. And I don't think I quite know what kind of poet I really want to be. I think I just end up feeling badly about whatever it is I've chosen. If I'm too similar, if I'm too different, that's just a characteristic dilemma on my part.
I'm sorry. I'm only laughing because I can relate to that so much.
Yeah. I was talking to my former teacher and friend Wayne Kostenbaum, and I've been asking a few former Commonplace guests to interview me about Sound Machine, and I'm trying to put an episode together. And so Wayne was so generous in reading the book and asking me questions, and but he described sort of all of my books, and in particularly Sound Machine, with this phrase that I think should have actually been the title for Sound Machine. But he said, well, as you've continued with your, I can't remember the adjective, but with your persistent rendering of scenes of self-castigation. And I was like, yeah, I guess scenes of self-castigation is really the hidden and not so hidden title for everything I've ever written.
That's funny. I mean, I sensed that too, I think, at least in this book. And I think that, even at times listening to Commonplace, but, and it's funny because there's always this sort of sense of presenting something as itself, whether that might be an emotion or some experience, some scene or something, but then kind of undercutting it in some way. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that move that feels, I don't know, that it does something, like it has this sort of self-awareness to it that it just feels really good to me. Like it feels like, I don't know, there's this way in which everybody has their little idiosyncrasies and everybody has their quirks and their flaws, but most of the time people don't address those in the work itself. I feel like there's something that feels very honest about foregrounding those things,
I do know, and I don't know whether that means that you suffer from a similar set of neurotic problems as I do, or if because I think it's certainly honest in the sense that this is just an accurate description of how my brain works and how I think everybody else's brains work. But it has come to my attention that not everybody goes through life the same way. Obviously in so many ways, including neurologically or experientially, temperamentally. And I think that there are probably people who find the thing that you're describing, as kind of honest, or that you like. I think there are probably people who just find it endlessly annoying because, I mean, or problematic. Why can't you just say one thing and leave it at that? Why back and forth, So I don't know. Thank you. I'm glad. But it might
you're kind of doing it now.
I know you might need the same kind of therapy I need is all I'm saying.
I do, obviously, of course, everyone's going to have their own their own experience and their own take on these things. I think that, well, I mean, if nothing else, I do think that there is something, when you see someone who has the same sort of preoccupations that you have, that there is something powerful about that when you see that in someone else's work. And certainly that's something that I've always responded to. And it's something that I hope to accomplish with my own work. I don't know. I just think that there is something to it. I also think, this idea that someone might be annoyed by something that you're doing in your work or that I'm doing in my work, I do think that's an interesting thing to consider, but also I think it's a little bit unreasonable, there is this sort of demand that many of us place on artists to have made the thing that we wanted them to make. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think, if anything, that's the more problematic piece of it, to me anyway.
Yeah. I have a whole armchair psychology sort of response to why you might also share or why you might like this.
I'm here for it.
Well,
I don't know about you, but I actually love it when people tell me about me.
I love it too. Yeah, I mean, I think obviously it's much more complex than this, and we don't really know each other, but just even from listening to your podcast and seeing some of your work online, your photographs and your writing, I was just thinking about that catapult piece that you wrote. Mm-hmm. And I think it's your grandmother who says to you that the Japanese Americans are the quiet minority. Is that what the phrase that she used? Yeah, the quiet people. Yeah, the quiet people. And I think that one of the things that, as you're talking about it, I think there's a desire that perhaps we share, to both be troublemakers, and more troublemakers, and to push ourselves to be outspoken and, to say the thing that maybe people don't usually say. And we appreciate when others say the thing or ask the question that people don't ask, or, those are some of the things that I think certainly appeal to me in art and in people. But then I think it's also, there's a lot of tension because I hear it in you, and I definitely see it in myself of there's another part where, we both have day jobs. We both have kids. We both, seem to me to be pretty organized, responsible, show up on time type of people, for lots of reasons. And, even the fact that we chose to be podcast hosts, there's a certain element of that I think requires someone to be a good listener and to be somewhat patient and be willing to kind of put the other person in the spotlight, even though there's a lot of power in being the person asking the questions and presenting. And so I think that there's an underlying kind of conflict, an interesting struggle between both of these aspects of, wanting to be the person who, says it all, or at least says something. And does something. And also a kind of, I'll just say this part for myself. I'm surprised at how much I care about what other people think of me. And I think that I've largely acted as if I haven't cared. And I think that other people sometimes perceive me as someone who is very bold and doesn't, and, is not going to care. But I think that that's more and more clear to me. And so there's a tension between those two things. And I think I have a fantasy that other artists are much bolder and less self-conscious, than I am. I don't know if that's really true or not, but I think that's part of the back and forth also. If you say the thing, but then you're oh my God, what'd I just say? Or, it's self-exposure with shame immediately following.
Yeah. I certainly can't speak for anybody else, but I find that, I have these sort of competing desires, to want to express myself, to want to say the things that I feel like need to be said and that I don't notice other people saying, at least not in the way that I want them to be said. But then also just like constantly feeling this like overwhelming shame of like what gives me the right to be that person,
Yeah.
of these competing impulses to like make myself large, but also to make myself as small and compact as possible. Who knows where that actually comes from? I think it's interesting, the thing that you just said about, feeling that other artists in some way or another have their shit together more, or are more confident. I know that you said a thing in your Inside Commonplace episode, which I said this to you when we met at AWP, that, but I'd like to say it again on the show, just that like that was one of the most just fascinating and illuminating and sort of exciting pieces of audio I've heard, maybe ever. And certainly in the interview podcast space, it really opened up a lot of things for me. One of the things that you said in that interview about sort of your process and your motivations with these things, that you're always asking other people how to be. Mm-hmm. And I was like, oh yeah, me too. But don't you kind of feel like, I mean, you've talked to a lot of people on your show now. I've talked to a good number of people on my show. And I think that one thing that has become clear in the course of talking to so many different artists and writers and what have you, is that it seems like most people, not everybody, but most people who do this stuff, never really get past that sense of like, what am I doing? kind of thing,
Yes, maybe, I don't know, but I never seem to get past the sense that I have that everybody knows exactly what they're doing, which I think is not true, but somehow I can't seem to let that go. I think that a lot of people I talk to, I envy them, or I'm, kind of in awe of them for seeming to have their shit together more than I do. But then there's all the people that I am in awe of who seem to have their shit together a lot less than I do. And that also seems kind of miraculous. And so like, as if that's how to live your life, to not care so much about certain things, or to only care about the things that really, really matter. Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. That's not really a good answer or response to what you said.
It's an interesting experience to be talking to someone who has many of the same sort of anxieties and preoccupations that I do, because I haven't been interviewed or recorded that many times as the guest, but I do know that I have said basically exactly that thing. That wasn't a very good answer. So one of the things that, I can't even remember now. I tried to go back and figure out like which was the first episode of Commonplace that I ever listened to, and I can't remember anymore. Mm. And I can't remember how I found the show. I'm sure that it was like somebody on Twitter shared an episode and I checked it out and then, became a regular listener. That's also how I eventually became interested in reading your writing. One of these things that, and this sort of to go back a little bit to what we were talking about at the beginning, there's, in this book, in the Pedestrians, you're working in multiple modes, and then obviously adding in mothers. That's a third way of sort of touching on similar themes, similar experiences, and processing them in different ways. I'm always very interested in people who do more than one kind of creative work. Mm. And I'm always sort of interested in like, why? Because like I do more than one thing and I have no idea why. And I kind of always find myself wishing I could just do one thing, Yeah. But it just doesn't work out that way. And the bigger thing too is that lately, for maybe the past, maybe year or so, I've found myself questioning a lot, what the actual site of my work is. Like, I find myself saying things like, I'll talk about my work, but when I talk about my work, I'm not including the show. Mm-hmm. But on a certain level, that feels like, well, this is where I'm spending almost all of my creative energy these days. Like, for 3 years now, I've been doing the podcast more regularly and spending more hours on it than I am on my writing or my photography. So in what way is that not my work? You know? And I was just sort of wondering if, like, I guess if there's a question here is like, is this a thing for you too?
Yes. I mean, a constant, yes. I mean, how do I even, yes. I mean, I'm so interested in this question in so many different ways. First of all, the question of, doing different kinds of creative work in the sense of different, working in different genres or different mediums. And what's interesting to me, again, to go back to scenes of self-castigation, is that I still have this firm belief that all the great, artists that I admire are all working in many different media except for me, which is crazy because of course I do work in different genres and audio being kind of a different thing altogether. But then pulling back to say, okay, well, what is creative work? Is it writing? Is it the podcast? Does it include teaching? And then, even further back, like, well, does it include being a parent? Does it, for you, like I notice on your website, and other places, you say you also work as a electrical engineer to pay the bills. And that addition of to pay the bills is an interesting one. It sort of indicates like, okay, but that's outside of your creative work. But is it outside of your creative work? I really don't know anything about being an electrical engineer, but, I'm thinking of the things in my life that would not normally be thought of as part of my creative process. But I certainly have, I was a doula, for a long time, and I was a photographer. But for a while, the only money I made as a photographer was very sort of like, more commercial stuff. So I think the question is, or what about other things that aren't even work? Is that part of your creative life? Like, I no longer have an exercise practice, but like people do, or spiritual practice, or, I think it's really interesting to think about why it's important to delineate creative from non-creative, work from not work. And I think there are good reasons to do that. But then I think if I'm being honest about my own process, all of the things are overlapping and mixed together. I mean, certainly I can't separate my family life from my quote unquote creative work because most of my writing is about my family. But it's not just that it's about my family as subject matter, but it's also that the writing process, my mind, my body, is very much connected to being a mother and my relationship with my children. And more the same is true for my teaching, which does not happen outside of my creative work. It's really more and more part of it. And for sure, I would say Sound Machine is the first book that I've had that's come out since I've been doing Commonplace. And every single piece in there, certainly in the editing, but also somewhat in the composition, is related to the experience of having talked to more than 70 people for hours about art. I can't separate that.
What I find, and, this is just the sort of distinction that I make, because, like, as you say, I am, you pointed this out, I am an electrical engineer to pay the bills. To me, it's unquestionable that all of the experiences that I have inform the work in one way or another. Like, to make a really literal example of that, I spend, 8 to 10 hours a day in a cubicle at my office doing, looking at a computer and, designing circuits and whatnot. And I made, a photo series that is semi-abstract office-scapes, I guess. And, the point being that I get really bored when I'm at work. All of these things sort of come into the mix because they all are part of what forms me and my experience. But I think what it has to do with for me is that the creative work feels different when I'm doing it, and it sort of satisfies a different need for me, if that makes sense. Like, I definitely can't say that my life as a parent or my life as an engineer or my life as a husband or a son or any of these things are completely separate from my creative work. But like when I'm doing my engineering work, it doesn't feel expressive to me. It doesn't feel satisfying to me. What it feels like is just something that I'm doing in order to survive. Whereas if I make a photo series about my engineering job, if I make a photo series about being bored at work or being sad that my kids are getting older or being, sort of wistful about the fact that I can't go home anymore in the way that I want to, that those things feel like they're accomplishing something that the other things don't. And they all feel like they're accomplishing something that is in common with each other. The podcast actually does feel that way in a different, it's different, but it still feels of a piece,
Wait, say more. Like you're saying it feels much more like creative work. Does it also have anything in common with work, for lack of a better term?
Well, all of these things have a certain amount of tedium to them that isn't necessarily pleasant, whether it's writing or editing photos or, trying to figure out how to properly compress audio or whatever. There's that sort of work kind of stuff. But, the making of the podcast feels like it is accomplishing something similar to what writing a poem or taking a photograph does, for me at least, but I don't know how that feels for you or for anybody else.
One of the things that I was thinking about, and I think I'm trying to say this without sounding sorry for myself or asking for some kind of sympathy. But I realized that I wrote one new piece, whether it's poem or prose, I'm not quite sure, last April. And I wrote one very long piece the June before. So April of 2018 and June of 2017. And other than that, I haven't been writing. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. And I also was about to say I haven't been making things. It's not like, I haven't been writing poems, but I've been working on, I taught myself to paint, no, I didn't. So I was feeling concerned about that, not in terms of productivity or like, what will happen? Am I done? I'm always like, I'm never writing any poems again. It's very boring, but, it is strange to have a new book out and not feel like a writer. And I don't feel like a writer unless I'm writing. And by writing for me, I never have written every day, but like more regular than one piece a year. And so that's a strange feeling. But then I go back and I think, how could you possibly say you haven't been making anything? Because that's the same time period basically that I've been, making all of these Commonplace episodes, and also that I've been working on this audio project that's also called Sound Machine of pieces from the book. And so Commonplace feels, and the audio project feel very fully, sacred and close to my heart. And I care about them, so deeply, and more I care about them. But I guess that there is something that is different for me about the experience of being inside a piece of writing. Maybe it's the kind of concentration, or something happens for me in writing that doesn't quite happen in making Commonplace or in making the audio. In part, I think the audio is because it's a collaboration and mostly the sound designer is kind of doing the manipulation or something. I don't know exactly how to describe it. So I don't know. I'm interested in that. Like there is something I used to say, and I don't know if I still think this is true, but I used to say that when I was writing, it was the only time that I didn't hear that incredibly self-critical voice in my head, that was just kind of, it was sort of like this holy space where even if what I was writing was negative or negative about myself or self-critical, that the experience was not self-critical and that it was kind of like a drug that, as soon as I was done writing it, I would first think, oh, this is the best thing I've ever written. And then as I moved away from it, I would kind of lose that confidence, lose that feeling of like just sort of being okay. And then it was like a drug. Like the only way to get that feeling again was to go back to the writing space. I don't know if that's as true for me now as it used to be. But whatever that quality is, there is something that it feels different to me about writing, and particularly maybe I would say writing poems or writing something that is within the world of the poem, because I don't feel it to the same extent when I'm writing prose. I find writing prose to be one of the most painful and horrible things in the whole world. Just brutal.
I want to keep talking about that, but I think we need to take a quick break and then come back and do the second segment.
Excellent.
So for the second segment, I always invite the guests to bring a topic of their own, which could be whatever you'd like to talk about, whatever happens to be on your mind. So what would you like to talk about today?
Well, as usual, the problem for me is that there are 100 things I really want to talk about, and I have a really hard time choosing. And also, I have a really hard time separating all the things. So I sort of had wanted to talk about my hysterectomy because I feel like it's very, very present for me, and people don't talk about health issues very much, and they don't talk about hysterectomies in particular. But there's no way. I also had wanted to just talk more about Commonplace. I'm also interested in talking about Sound Machine is coming out, and it's my first book in 5 years, which in and of itself is not a long time, but it feels like a long time for me. Some things have changed since my last books were out, and so I'm sort of interested in that. I'm sort of just like this interesting to me moment of being 47 with a 20-year-old, an 18-year-old, and a 12-year-old, and sort of having a very boring but fascinating to me midlife crisis. But all of those things are the same thing. And then I was like, maybe I should talk to Mike about photography because that's a big interest of mine. And you're a photographer, and it overlaps with all this other stuff. And yeah, I can't separate any of those things because they're all the same. Like there is none of those things exist outside of my physical experience or what like my life has been like for the past 6 months. With the anemia and the hysterectomy, but the anemia and the hysterectomy also don't exist without sort of, or the context of them or my feelings about them don't exist without, everything that came before. So now I will say to you, what would you like to talk about? Since I refuse to choose.
Yeah. It's really funny. Sometimes people, I mentioned this to you in our correspondence beforehand. And it's the same thing that I tell everybody, that like the purpose of the second segment is to just make sure that I'm not like dominating the conversation and to make sure that you get a chance to talk about something that you'd like to talk about. I do find it's really interesting. And you know, since we've sort of talked about ways that we might be similar, I think maybe you might be able to relate to this, that it's like, there's a certain amount of like, the word we used before was shame about, you know, having this sort of weird power in being the host. And so doing everything I can to try and like disperse that a little bit. I think it's funny how some people really don't end up wanting to pick for themselves.
Yeah.
I do. One thing that occurred to me when you were saying all that is that it really makes sense to me. They are all connected. And actually, I feel like in the title poem of the Pedestrians, so the book is called The Pedestrians, the poem is called Pedestrian, is like a really great example of that. How, like, you know, in this poem, it's sort of like this stream of consciousness of the poem speaker as she's walking out on a walk through the city, and all of these different things that are going through her mind all at the same time, you know, like interrupting one after the other. I thought that I think it's interesting to hear you say that now, given that I just reread that poem yesterday. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny how it all kind of goes together that way, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that I'm trying to pick positive or at least neutral words instead of self-critical ones. Cause I was going to say like neurotic, self-interrupting, you know, but what if I say, you know, that kind of fluidity and porousness to what's happening inside and outside all around me, like an openness, to allow, all of those things into the poem. I think that that's like as I was saying earlier, both kind of temperamental, possibly even like neurological, but also political. And, you know, a kind of version of the personal as political, both in terms of allowing the domestic space to be the space of creativity, or the space of, instead of the space that's usually like pushed to the side, or the thing that we don't look at or we think is, antithetical to work or art, to allow that to be seen. And the same thing, you know, I think with women's bodies, the body in both men and women's bodies, but in particular women's bodies because of the history of male domination over science and history and literature and basically everything, in which there's like so little genuine understanding of women's bodies. So I think, you know, allowing all of those things into the poem is not something I could have actually controlled or chosen not to do, but I think it's also has political, social implications. Mm-hmm. And so maybe that's just a way of feeling less guilty, for my interrupted mind. But right now, today, I'm going to try to confidently say it is a style or an aesthetic.
I mean, it's certainly a choice. And I think it's one, to me, you know, when I read that poem, I was like, I mean, maybe not everybody is quite as, the word you used, porous, as I think. Maybe not everyone thinks in quite this way, experiences in quite this way. To me, it felt very familiar. Mm-hmm. But I do think there's something to this idea that we all have, like that we don't think linearly, that we do, you know, experience simultaneity, you know, all of these things that we have. They're more than just one thing at any particular moment. And I think that sort of bears on, you know, all of these different topics that you're talking about And to me, both in that poem, in Commonplace, I mentioned in the first segment, I mentioned that episode 50, Inside Commonplace, how it was really revelatory for me. I think one of the things that was the big revelation for me about that was that it is really okay to be the host of, something that is at least nominally an interview show. I know you always like to call your what you do conversations and not interviews. That's something that I also prefer. But, the genre, if we want to call it that, is the interview podcast, I guess. But that it is acceptable. And at least for me as a listener to that episode, was even exciting to see the host of the show inserting herself into it and being exposing herself in a way. It's very the opposite of what Terry Gross does, for example, right? Can listen to Fresh Air every day for 20 years and really have very little idea of who Terry Gross is. And that's by design. She actually, there was that series, that Jesse Thorne did, the turnaround.
I love that series.
Yeah, it was great, right?
Yeah.
And she talked about how she doesn't want to be in the interview, right? She doesn't want to be a character in it. But to me, what you were doing in Inside Commonplace, something also I think you're doing in these poems, and something I feel is in the dynamic between you and me right now, that there is this, this might be a little bit of a fraught thing to say, but I feel this sense of permission, when I read these things, listen to the things that you've done before, of not having it have to be one thing or the other, of allowing it to be expressive of oneself, that there's something very freeing about that,
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. When we started the second segment, I resisted the impulse to say, well, maybe we should both take this opportunity to each say what we will likely regret most when we finish this conversation. Because I know, now I know you well enough to know for sure we're going to get off the phone and both of us are going to be like, oh God, why didn't I? Or why did I? Or at least I know I will, and I suspect you will. And the reason I'm saying that in part is because you've acknowledged that you've tried to build into the structure of the show at least one way of making sure that you don't get off the phone and think I didn't let them talk about what they wanted to talk about, and I had too much power, and so you're trying to build that into the show. And I think it's similar to my trying to say, oh, these aren't interviews, these are conversations, because that implies a more equal playing field. And so I think that's really interesting. And I think that permission is such an interesting word. And I'm glad to know that something that I'm doing in writing and in Commonplace is giving at least you but other people too. And they've said this to me, a sense of permission. And I think to some extent, it is because of that thing that you're saying, where I'm sort of saying two things at once, and neither of which or both of which are true. And so there's a permission in that, and not having to choose, and not having to have one thing or one judgment be the end of everything. But I think also I'm constantly searching for and hearing permission in other people. I kind of want to say something about what you just said, now that I said something slightly nice about myself, I'm going to say something not nice. It's not nice, but I think again, there's Commonplace has so many of the same kind of challenges and benefits as every other part of my life. And I think that's just kind of how it is for me. And I think putting myself in the poems, putting myself in the show in the way that I do. Like I said, it is a choice, but it's not really a choice. Like, I don't know how to do it otherwise. I can't be Terry Gross. I'm not cut out to be Terry Gross. I don't want to be Terry Gross. I'm glad Terry Gross is Terry Gross. But it's like a totally different dynamic, for me. And I think that people do respond to that, positively. A lot of the feedback that I get from about Commonplace is particularly around that, like liking the way that I reveal stuff about myself but there are some really potentially yucky consequences to that as well. And I don't know if you find this in your podcasting experience, but it can happen with anyone. You mentioned, I'm just being so inarticulate right now and vague. And I think it's because I'm getting to a topic that's uncomfortable to me. And you mentioned to me, or no, you tweeted about something about it online about my conversation with Mira Jacob. Mm-hmm. But I felt the thing that I'm trying to describe, was definitely present for me in that conversation. And I think it has to do with a lot of things that I'm just kind of trying to understand. But part of it is about empathy and identification and how that works between two people, especially when there is a power differential, and there's always going to be a power differential in the podcast. But then on top of that, when I feel like whiteness is very much present in the room, because I'm white, I certainly have, white passing privilege. And I think that there's something that's complicated around identification and empathy. So to be more explicit, like, if somebody says something to me about their experience and then I say, oh yeah, me too. I had that exact same experience, which hopefully I don't say that, but that's an extreme version of what it is sort of like when I'm bringing my own experience into the room. And, to say you have the same experience as someone else is not great. It's also never true. And then on top of that, if you are a white person saying like, oh, I understand exactly what you're saying because I had that same exact experience. That's, pretty racism 101, starting point. So I think that's an interesting thing that I've been thinking about a lot and thinking about like in terms of the podcast, just, how to be really present in the room, how to be really thoughtful about the difference between my experience and the experience of whomever I'm speaking with, and how to make connections and be respectful of distance, both in shared experiences and experiences that are not shared. And that's all really, really complicated.
It is. Anybody who pays attention to what I do on Twitter knows that I will go on at length about this kind of thing. I think that the Twitter thread that you mentioned was actually one of my shorter ones, but I was talking about your conversation with Mira Jacob, and also I think it was David Naiman's conversation with Miriam Taves on Between the Covers. Mm-hmm. I definitely think that one of the things I was talking about at that time was sort of the potential pitfalls of, when you have a guest on your show, there is a power differential. And then also, how is that going to work when you're trying to communicate across difference? But also, one thing that you didn't mention was that I also think one of the things that I found really striking about both of those conversations is that there are ways in which, like, you and Mira Jacob were talking about things that, yes, you were talking about things across the difference because you're white and she's a person of color. But also there were parts where you were talking about things across a similarity because you're both women. And I just thought it was really fascinating to sort of hear the difference in not just how the conversation unfolded in terms of the content, but in terms of what each of you sounded like. in each of those different, like whether you're speaking across a similarity or a difference. So I think there is that moment of connection. One of the things that I also am thinking about as you're talking about this is I'm always very tentative. I was actually thinking about this before we started talking this morning when I got out of bed. I was eating my breakfast and I was thinking exactly about this. You know, like what are the ways that Rachel and I are similar? What are the ways that we are different? I was thinking like, well, you know, we're not racially similar and we're not similar in gender. We are both podcasters who write and do other things. One of the things I'm always very tentative about these things is I was actually just talking to my wife about this last night when we were coming home from dinner. And I was saying to her that like so much of the energy that I put into how I present myself is to avoid being that guy, you know, to avoid being this sort of stereotypical awful man. And, and that is something that I actually think, I mean, it's a site of a certain amount of, shame and tension for me, sort of emotional distress, I suppose. But I also think that is like maybe my responsibility as a man. I think that more men should be doing that right now. But when it comes to the podcast, like one of the things I'm thinking about, this tentativeness that I have to want to claim a certain common experience or to claim a certain similarity, because I don't want to presume. Like a few times I've had guests on my show who were Korean American, for example. And I am not Korean American. We are both Asian American in this case, but not of the same ethnicity. And as you might know, like the history of like Koreans and Japanese and Korean Americans and Japanese Americans has at times been very fraught. And the relationship between Korea and Japan right now is still very fraught. And so when I would have Korean American guests on my show, I have this thing where when I read their books, because of the fact that we're both Asian American, I'm reading these things where you know, and like some of them are writing memoir, right? So they're talking very specifically about their own experience, and I will latch onto these things in their books and be like, this is exactly the thing that I experienced. Like I had almost verbatim this exact interaction with someone when I was a child. And so there's that, I want to make that connection there, right? But then when it comes time to actually record the conversation for the show, I will say something like I'll preface the whole thing by saying, I know that like we're not the same in this way. Like I want to be very careful of not claiming this as my own, because I'm not Korean American. And so I feel a little hesitation. Like I actually would say that explicitly in the recording. And I every time I've done that, it comes out of this impulse to not be that guy, right? It comes out of this impulse to be protective and respectful, right? But I feel like it actually comes off a little off-putting to the guest. Like, I think every time I've done that, and I try not to do that anymore, actually, like very consciously, because I feel like they don't know what to do with that.
Yeah.
You know, like it's not what they were expecting me to say. And I feel like that's an interesting dynamic too, that I'm not like, what is like by putting that out there, what am I asking of that person? You know what I mean?
Yeah. I think right. Because even though I think that impulse comes from such a good, respectful place, to say, I know we are not the same. I'm not taking your experience as my own. And, you know, we know that the idea of like the universal experience is so problematic and doesn't really exist. But then, yeah, as soon as you say that, you run the risk of exoticizing the other person or putting them in a position where, you know, they're going to, in a way, have to be the representative for all the things that are different about them than you. Or even the kind of sort of strangeness of, there's like a way in which that comment, and I've made very, very similar kinds of, what's the word? Like, not an apology, but, like, hey, I just want to say I notice that I'm white and you're a person of color. Obviously, I have never said it in that way. Because to not notice is a huge problem, but to notice and point it out is also very strange.
Yeah.
And yet I guess I do tend to err on the side of pointing out every uncomfortable thing. I mean, this comes up for me in every single episode. I mean, this morning before we spoke, I was working on my introduction, for the Ilya Kaminsky episode, which is going to come out next on Commonplace. And
I'm really looking forward to that, by the way.
Thank you. I am also really looking forward to that. And I'll tell you something that I've been trying to write in the introduction that I might just take out. And it's interesting also to think about, like, why am I willing to say this in the context of your podcast, but not necessarily as the introduction? And I think that partly has to do with different forms and different positions of power, and the way in which an introduction in my podcast is a kind of authoritative stance, whereas being a guest on your podcast maybe allows me to share this thing that I'm really thinking through, and I'm full of doubt. And I think in the context of being a guest on your podcast, it will hopefully come across more accurately as something that I'm really not sure of. So when I was recording with Ilya is hard of hearing and also has a strong Russian accent. And so there were moments where I couldn't understand what he was saying. Also, I don't know if you've ever seen Ilya read in person, but he hands out either copies of his book or Xerox packets of what he's going to read, so the audience can read along with him. And I think it's a pretty straightforward accessibility question for audience members who are deaf or hard of hearing, but he hands them out to everyone. And so someone like me who is hearing, I have the experience that I don't usually have at a poetry reading, where I am looking at the text and listening at the same time. And there were some really interesting things that I noticed in my own experience of what it was like to have the text in front of me and hear Ilya read. And there were some really interesting things that I noticed about the process of talking to Ilya in person and not knowing, having to slow down, having to be more careful about making myself understood to him and of making sure that I understood him. So asking sometimes for him to repeat things, or having to ask for clarification sometimes. Or at one point there was a critical word that he was pronouncing differently than you would expect if you were a native English speaker. And I could not tell from the context of what this critical word was. And it was very exciting for me, actually. And then when I finally figured out what the word was, he kept using the word St. John. And I was like, I just don't know what that is. And then I realized he was saying singing. And so I was trying to write in this introduction about how one of the things I love most in art is the way in which you can experience the process of something taking shape and something coming into focus and something beginning to gather and have meaning, rather than just seeing it fully formed. So whether it's a novel or a short story where you don't know what the story is going to be, and then all of a sudden the story starts to take shape, right? Or whether it's a poem in which the language is doing something that's not traditional, that's not, there's a sort of like it's not just easily accessible or transparent or clear, in terms of its narrative. And then the meaning sort of begins to take shape, rises to the surface. That's one of my most favorite experiences. And that to some extent that's happening every time we have a conversation with another person, but it's not so clear because we think that we are understood, and we have very little tolerance in normal daily life for understanding someone else. But that in my conversation with Ilya, this was one of the things I enjoyed the most of my conversation with him. But how do you say that without either idealizing or, glorifying, a hearing loss issue, right? Like, or even metaphorizing it and being insensitive to issues around accessibility. Because I'm saying, oh, as a hearing person who can, it was so interesting to me. It was so exciting to me. And there was no way, I could not find a way to really, or I haven't yet, and we'll see. I might just leave this out of the introduction. It might not be a place where I can get at some of these ideas, without sort of seeming, I'm trying not to use the word tone deaf in this context, but even that phrase, how do you do that while recognizing that that's a completely, that handing out the text might be interesting to me, but it's the difference between having access or not access if you're deaf or hearing impaired, and making it clear that you understand the difference between those two experiences.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what you're also talking about. And I think, I don't have a set of guidelines or rules for myself about that, but I'm starting to realize that so much of that has to do with what kind of power I have at any given moment. And the context of that, of course, keeps changing. And so you, as the host of the podcast, have a lot of power in that. And so in that moment, saying, I just want to recognize, that, we don't have the same experience, might come across very differently, if you are the guest or if you are in another context.
I mean, I think, when I think about this, right? Well, first of all, I actually have heard Ilya give a reading before, just once. He actually is here in San Diego. Mm-hmm. He teaches at SDSU. And he gave a reading at Grossmont College, earlier, I think in the spring. I did get to see him do that. And he did, as you say, he passed out Xerox copies to everyone in the audience. What I think is kind of interesting in the context of this conversation that we're having, he also had sign interpreters while he was reading. To me, what I thought was interesting was that he actually very explicitly made that that act of passing out the handouts. He made that very explicitly about accessibility for people who can hear, because he actually calls this out. He said in the thing, like, you're not going to be able to understand everything I say, so this is to help you. And I thought that it's interesting because, like, the thing that you're talking about with this intro and the sort of struggle that you're having with it is, like, you don't want to put that person in the position of being the other, but it means something different when they do it themselves.
Right.
And the thing that I keep coming back to, and it seems like we go through a similar process of, like, I'm trying to figure out what are the consequences of the things that I do, what are the, like, practical effects of the choices that I make. Because I have this desire. I think what it is when I made that move in those conversations that I had with those previous guests, the desire that I have, and I might do this then, I might do this in an intro or in the outro, or like maybe in a separate piece of writing. I want somehow it to be made clear to anyone who is consuming this content. I want them to understand that I'm aware of these things and that I'm not just taking these things for granted, because I don't want to be that guy.
Yeah.
But then, like, where I go after that is, well, like, but like, what does that serve for me to make it clear? Like, what am I actually asking? Like, is that more for me that I'm doing that? Because, like, is it more for me because I don't want people to think I'm that guy? Or is it that I am actually doing something, like, for the world or for the guest or for the listener? Like, which of those things is it? And the only thing I can come up with is that it's both, right? Like, that it is out of a desire to put, like, helpful or at least non-harmful things out into the world. But also it is a desire to, like, have people think of me kindly, right? Mm-hmm. It's both of those things.
Right. I mean, yeah, absolutely. And I think if you're prone to shame, you're gonna feel badly no matter what, because it really is both of those things. And, I mean, my idea that, yes, Ilya is handing those handouts out not only for deaf and hearing impaired people, but also for people who can hear easily. And he says that part of it is about his Russian accent. And indeed, people have various, abilities to hear through accent. But I guess what I'm saying is it's fascinating to me that, I mean, haven't you been at many, many poetry readings where the person is a native English speaker and speaks loudly enough and and you can't understand them? Right? Do those people hand out or give context to their work? Often not. And that's interesting to me that like we have and I think that this is a personal issue for me because I think that, my work, I think, maybe it has a lot of doubt in it and simultaneity and, whatever neuroticness to it, but it's pretty transparent. It's pretty, to use this word, in both its meanings, accessible. And I think that I have both very positive feelings about that and very negative feelings about it. Like, oh, I'm not a real artist because maybe my work is too accessible. But I also have the feeling that, I don't like making other people feel dumb or outside of, it's just kind of obsessively my way to if I'm speaking to another person, to try to include them on almost every level. Not because I'm a great person or whatever, but, maybe I just really want to be understood or something. I don't really know, but I think that it's exactly what you're saying, that there is a real generosity and kindness, to including everything. Of course, you can never include everything, but including context, including, for the listener, for the reader, for the person that you're interacting with, treating that other person, with as much kindness and respect. And part of that is about sort of letting them know all the things, right? All the things that are going through your head. But then, yes, of course, there's for sure, like, I don't want to seem like that guy who is, not aware of how I sound, or is making a million mistakes, even more than I could make if I'm careful, or including so much that you sort of don't respect your audience enough to know what they need to know, or to have the experience that I just said I enjoyed, which is of not everything being clear. So I don't know. I just said a million different things, but I find these things totally fascinating. And, I don't know if this is your experience, but in part I started Commonplace because, I found writing to be increasingly full of ethical pitfalls. And I thought that a podcast, especially a podcast in which I was speaking to the other person that I was representing, they were then representing themselves, that this would enable me to not have the same ethical pitfalls, or complications. And of course, it has all the same and even, different ones than writing does or any kind of art. And I'm trying to just kind of like embrace those a little bit, and do what I hear you saying, which is to kind of learn from them and figure out like, okay, well, if I do it this way, I feel this kind of shame. If I do it this way, I feel this kind of shame. Could I at least get to the point in my life where I'm feeling new kinds of shame rather than the same kinds of shame over and over again?
Yeah. Oh my God.
And also, I guess I'll say one other thing. I'm talking on and on. I'm so sorry. But I think it is moments like these, like talking to you, where that is not how I feel when I hear you on your podcast. And I am hearing you say to me that you are hearing something that's useful, permission giving, and positive on my podcast. And so taking those kinds of support and encouragement in order to have, to kind of take the risks, to know that, you're not that guy.
Yeah. So, I actually would love to continue talking about this, but I think that we probably need to wrap things up. There's one question that I always like to end with, and that is if there is a piece of art or literature or creativity in some form that you've experienced recently that meant something to you.
Oh, yeah. Well, since my return to somewhat of a clearer mental capacity, I read, Darcy Steinke's book, Flash Diary. You're going to have to look that up and fix that for me somehow. And it's an incredible book. It's about menopause. There's almost nothing written about menopause that's useful. And I really hope I can get her to come on Commonplace and talk more about it. But also the form of the book, is really fascinating to me. It's one of these kind of like a historical scientific memoirs. And that's a kind of form that I really love. And then, yesterday I finished, Tina Chang's new book, Hybrida, which is fantastic. And, about motherhood, about language, about race, about raising a mixed race child. It's a really, really great book. So those are the two things I've read in the past, few weeks that I've just really, loved.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for talking with me. I really had a good time, and I appreciate you coming on the show.
You too, Mike. I love your podcast, and it's fun and horrible, but mostly fun to be on the other side.
Okay, so the name of that book that Rachel mentioned, which she asked me to fix, that's Flash Count Diary by Darcy Steinke, and there is a link in the show notes for that. You'll also find links for the Pedestrians, for Sound Machine, both the book and the audio project, for Commonplace, and for Rachel's book Mothers. Do be sure to check out any or all of those. And that is our show. If you enjoyed today's episode and you want to tell me about it, or if you have a question you'd like to ask, or if you just want to tell me what you had for breakfast today, you can find me and the show on Twitter and Instagram at ChannelOpenPod, on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechannelopen, and you can get me via email at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. If you'd like to do something extra nice, you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts, and if you'd really like to knock my socks off, you could make a monthly pledge to our Patreon campaign, which you can find at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. We'll be back on August 28th with a conversation with photographer Robert Calafiore, so do be sure to come back for that one. And until then, remember, keep the channel open.